so here we are. Time for our message. Time for week 2 of A Theory of Sin. I'm going to do a quick recap of what we talked about last week, because even if you were here, you might not remember. And it's going to be just a shorter version of the big talking points that we had last week, just to refresh us or to let people who weren't here in on what we're talking about. So the first thing that we talked about was God's perfect mechanism, and we said that God made a way for the world to operate perfectly, right? We wonder, why is there all this pain? Why is there all of this bad stuff in the world? God didn't want that stuff. It wasn't in the plan, right? There's a way that all of us should work and act, right, that would make the world paradise again, right? But here's the problem. God gave us the ability to make choices. That's called autonomy, right? We have the ability to diverge from this perfect way. And we're referencing this perfect way as God's universal or natural laws. One of the analogies that we used last week is that if someone builds a car, right, there's a lot of intricate parts that have to do their job, do what they were made to do in order for this car to run. Now imagine if the maker of this car gave the ability for each and every part to be able to diverge from their purpose, right? They can choose to act like they were made to, or they cannot. What's going to happen to that car if one of those parts goes rogue? Right? One part will break another part, that part will start messing up, and it's a chain reaction, and this car will not work, right? And that's where we are now, right? It's like God made this car and said, but by the way, you can all choose to live in this perfect way, or you cannot, right? And we say whenever we diverge from God's universal law, that's what sin is, right? That's sin. We're choosing to diverge from God's natural laws. It's almost like the laws of science or the laws of physics. God made moral laws, and when we diverge from those, that's what sin is. So we also talked about what is God's perfect way, right? If God made this way for people to operate perfectly, what is it? And the Bible talks about this extensively. And it's wrapped up in Jesus, when Jesus says it in each of the Gospels. He says that God's perfect way is this. It's following God and loving others like you love yourself. Following God is actually that's a little bit of a Joshism. What Jesus actually says is to love God with all your heart, soul, and all your mind. Right? So be totally devoted to God, understand God, live in the reality with God, and then put others' needs above your own. Love others as much as you love yourself. Right? That's God's perfect way. So we've got God's perfect way, and we know that we sin whenever we diverge from this perfect way. So what's sin? It's anytime we break God's natural laws. So that's where we came up with our theory of sin. The whole point of this series is to understand what makes something sinful, right? Because what did we start off the series saying? Life is complex. There's millions of instances all the time where we have to decide, is this godly or ungodly? Every choice, every thought, every word, everything, it can be godly or it can be ungodly, right? So if we want to try and be godly with our lives, we have to be able to ask ourselves and reason with ourselves for every choice that we have, and we should be able to ask ourselves, is this godly? So that's why we're digging into what sin is and what makes something sinful, because it'll help us understand and be able to deliberate what is sin. And when we make those choices, we can have more confidence and more conviction about what is sinful and what is not. So that's why we're talking about this. And here is our theory of sin based on all of these biblical principles that we've talked about already. Anytime we hurt others more than we heal others. Anytime that we hurt others more than we heal others. One other thing that we said is that this is our theory of sin that we're working with, right? This is not universally accepted teaching. One of the reasons that I said it's not is because people don't think about it, and that's a problem, right? That's probably the biggest reason why this might cause some dissonance with more conventional teaching. But if the conventional teaching was more fleshed out, I think we'd all come to this same conclusion. It's anytime we hurt others more than we heal others. Here's our forward for today, our scientific method. This is kind of what the rest of this series is going to look like. We're going to flesh out this theory a little more, right? And talk about some aspects of it a little more. And then the last 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to be applying that theory to typical situations where we might think this is sin, right? We're going to talk about things that a lot of churches talk about all the time and we don't. So like drinking, swearing, gluttony, things like that, coming to church, the Sabbath, those are all things that we're going to be talking about, and we're going to apply our theory of sin, and then we're going to see if we abide by our theory of sin in those situations, how much do we look like Jesus? So this is the hypothesis in the scientific method, that sin is anytime we hurt others more than we heal others. The experiment is applying it to these situations like drinking, smoking, swearing, all of those things. And then the conclusion will come from how much do we look like Jesus, right? So that's kind of the mathematical formula that we're going to be experimenting with here. Okay. Everybody with me? Amen. End of recap. Okay. So I want to break down this theory of sin a little more. Anytime we hurt others more than we heal others. We talked about 2 words that have to do with ethical schools of thought last week, and those were relative morality and utilitarianism. And we're going to break those down today. If you don't know, remember what those were. Relative morality is just a situation or an action is moral or not only relative to the situation, right? We're relatively moral. So something's going to be a sin in one place, but it won't be a sin in other places. It's just relative to who it is and where it is and what's going on. The example that we used last week is wearing shorts to a Southern Baptist church, right? It would be sinful to do that because we'd be disrespecting their culture and establishment. But does that mean that wearing shorts is sinful? No, it's relative to the situation, right? So we all agree with that at least a little bit. Right? We can see that that is godly, at least a little bit. And then the utilitarianism, that's an ethical school of thought that says you should take any action where the good outweighs the bad. Right? If you create utility, which is a word for goodness, happiness, joy, peace, life. If you create good stuff, if you create more good stuff from an action than you do bad stuff, you should take it. And the example that we used last week is Hiroshima, right? We said that, yes, we killed millions of people when we dropped the bomb, but millions of more lives would have been lost if we hadn't done that. So it was a utilitarian argument that led us to that action, right? And again, we all agree with this as Christians at least a little bit, and the verse that we used is spare the rod, spoil the child, right? When you spank your kid, it creates negative utility. It creates pain, right? That's the opposite of utility, is pain, hurt, death, negative consequences, right? But what is worse than the pain of a spanking? Growing up a spoiled brat, right? That's worse. The verse said if you hate your child if you don't discipline him, right? And we talked all about that. So we all buy into utilitarianism biblically, at least a little bit, right? Now, I don't know if you've noticed or not, but our theory of sin is extremely utilitarian. In fact, it is utilitarian full stop, if we're just going by this theory. It also implies relative morality, right? Because look at, anytime we hurt others more than we heal others, that's what sin is. That's utilitarianism, right? What I want to do today is actually point out some of the problems in this theory, which you might be going, ugh! Come on, Josh, why are you talking bad about your own argument? Because if we want to know God, we have to seek all the truth, right? When we stop short, when we don't poke holes in our own arguments, then we're not really seeking the truth. We're just seeking accomplishment for ourselves. We just want to be right, right? If you want to be godly rather than right, then you have to poke holes in your own arguments. Point out the flaws, see what's going on, and then dig deeper. And then dig deeper. So that's what we're going to do today. And spoiler alert, me deciding to do this message today added another week to the series. So big surprise there. So let's get into it today. I'm going to do one of my less conventional communication styles today. We can go to the next slide. Sometimes I like to do a very minimal PowerPoint presentation. Partially because I think I'm a better speaker if I don't have a PowerPoint. Secondly, it tricks our brain because sometimes if we're so used to the same message delivery style every week, it's easier to tune it out, right? So I wanted to kind of shake it up. And, we always use the example of going to the gym. If you do the same thing at the gym every time, it becomes ineffective, right? So this is a different style of workout. We're going to be doing Pilates today instead of running on the treadmill. Both bad. Okay. A Theory of Sin, week 2. This is our only slide for today, and it has all of our talking points and most of our references, and that is just a timeline of things so we can stay on track. And if you zone out for a second, which we never do that, right? We've never zoned out at church ever before. But just in case you do, you can pick up where we are again on this slide. So let's get into it. What are we talking about? Yeah, I was like, did I go to Wendy's twice yesterday? I don't know. The problems with our theory, specifically insufficient data. Here's the big problem with both relative morality and utilitarianism. They both have one big gaping hole in the arguments from a biblical standpoint. The first one, well, there's two problems, but I'm going to talk specifically about the bigger one. The first one that I'm not going to talk about today is that the Bible values others more than it values self, right? So, like, for example, this is one of the problems that regular secular people who do ethics, that they have with utilitarianism, is that you could have like a psychopath who gets tons and tons of utility from like murdering children, right? Now that would create a lot of negative utility, but theoretically with utilitarianism, right, there's a way that maybe more utility would be created with that action if this guy enjoys it enough. Or take like a kleptomaniac, right? This guy, some person who's a klepto might just love stealing. And maybe he doesn't steal huge stuff that would really, really affect people, so there's not a ton of negative utility, right? But does that make stealing okay if this guy gets a ton of pleasure from it? Ethicists would say no. I don't know if that's the word for that. People who practice ethics or study ethics would say no. That's the problem with utilitarianism, is that it doesn't factor in others. Same thing with relative morality, right? You know, we say that, hey, how much life is created in us counts biblically, which it does. God values when we have joy, when we have utility, but God values other people's. That's the perfect way, is that we value others more than self. So there are those two problems. The bigger problem, though, is insufficient data. And I'm going to break this down. First, in utilitarianism. In utilitarianism, insufficient data, especially from a Christian perspective, is very, very, very problematic. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by insufficient data? The first thing is, so say you're trying to take an action and you're wondering if it's godly or ungodly, and you use this utilitarian argument. Does it heal others more than it hurts others? Or even more basic to utility, does it create more utility than it destroys or removes? Right? Here's the question. How do you know? How do you know how much utility is created from an action? How do you know how much good is produced? How do you measure good, right? How do you measure utility? What is a util, right? We don't know, right? It's theoretical. So part of the problem that's coming up here is that we can't quite determine whether actions are godly or ungodly completely just off of this theory, because we don't know. We can guess, right? We can guess, but we don't know to a precise science how much good is being created versus how much bad. I've definitely justified blowing off a friend to stay in before. Like, I've had plans with a friend, and I've even been straight up with that friend, like, hey, I'm exhausted. I need a day where I'm a little selfish, and I take a Sabbath, and I have to be rejuvenated. So I can't come to lunch. I have to cancel plans, right? And I justified that with this theory of sin, right? It hurt people more if I was grinding to the bone all the time. If I don't take a break, I'm creating more pain than life if I don't take a day off. So I justified that action of taking a day off with this theory of sin. But what I don't know is maybe that other person really, really, really needed that lunch. And I don't know. Maybe they were on their last straw. I don't know, right? So I'm just guessing. Maybe I was wrong with using this theory of sin, determining whether that action was godly or ungodly. I can guess, and that's important and that's relevant for the rest of today's message. The theory is still helpful, spoiler alert, but it's not foolproof, right? Take Adam's example, utilitarianism. When Adam was in the garden, and Adam and Eve, both of them, when they sinned, right? God told them, hey, I've made this perfect world, right? Here's this universal law. And it was so easy for them. They only had one thing that they weren't supposed to do, right? And that was, don't be greedy. That's really what it was. Don't be greedy. Don't want more. And then the devil uses an almost utilitarian argument to convince them to go against God. Because the devil's reaction to eating this fruit that would enlighten them to the knowledge of good and evil, right, was, come on, what's the big deal? In other words, who's really going to be hurt by this, right? We all understand that causing hurt and pain is ungodly. It's written on the tablet of our hearts, right? We all know. All humans know, not just Christians. We all know that we should save someone if we have the chance and it's not going to hurt us. Stuff like that, etc. So the devil says, what's the big deal? You know, why not do it? And then they do it. What happens? Kind of screwed the pooch on that one, didn't they, right? We're all here now with pain in a fallen world, right? Where all of these mistakes happen, all of these horrible tragedies are happening because they were the first piece in the car to diverge from the plan, right? The car was running smooth, and then the one piece that God gave autonomy, it decided to diverge from its natural course, right? It chose the wrong thing. And then what happened? Tons of negative utility was created. Right? We've all got this pain now. We've all got death was created. Right? That's pretty bad. So here's the problem. Adam and Eve didn't know that. They didn't know all of the stuff, all of the repercussions that would come from their action, but God did. Only God has a sufficient data to say what's going to create more utility than it will destroy, right? And the devil had this smooth argument saying, oh, it's not that big of a deal. God's totally overselling this thing. But God knows. And we don't, right? So that's a big hole in utilitarianism, is that we don't know how much utility is going to be created, and we don't know the negative repercussions of actions, right? We might already be thinking that our theory is then useless. Let's pick it apart even more. Take the pastor in the 1900s who reads 1 John, relative morality. There used to be, and we all know this, right, because we've seen the repercussions of this happening, but pastors 100 years ago or 150 years ago sounded a lot different than most of them do now. It was a lot more about fear. Even Billy Graham had a lot of fear in his preaching, right? Fear of hell. And that's still good, but like there was a large portion of pastors 100 years ago that even preached fear of God, right? So it's this whole thing about God's vengeful, God's mean, God's cruel, and if you screw up, then you're going to be punished. And that was our entire incentive to try and be godly. And that's very, very unbiblical. That was missing the mark when pastors preached like that. So, side note, lesson, always be skeptical of the church, because there could be big problems. Because what would happen when this pastor in the 1900s who preaches this fear, what if he justified it with, hey, this is what we all do, right? Everyone preaches like this, and if I didn't preach like this, I'd be laughed out of town, right? Why would a pastor in the 1900s think that? He read the Bible, right? 1 John says that there is no fear in love, and perfect love casts out fear. Someone say it's good. That's how we should preach God, right? That's how we accurately depict the Lord and His plan for our lives. And when we say God doesn't want us to be afraid at all, and following God should lead to the absence of fear, not the accumulation of it, right? So this pastor in the 1900s who reads 1 John goes, this kind of doesn't jive with how I'm preaching, but everyone else is preaching this way. Should I take a stand and make that my thing? No, this is right for my culture, and I'm a more effective preacher in my culture if I act this way, right? So we can justify it based on our culture. That happens a lot today. But he reads 1 John, he's convicted. Here's the problem. He doesn't realize the problems that this is creating, right? There's a lot of people that left the church either because they didn't like God, because He's mean, sounds bad, and I'd rather just ignore it and think that He's not real, or God stopped making sense because they'd read all this stuff in the Bible about God's love and go, all I know is to fear God. So where does that happen? The Bible is conflicting with itself, so it must not be real, right? Point being, if an action is relatively okay to one culture, that doesn't mean that it won't have repercussions in another culture where those repercussions are negative, right? So if we can justify, this is okay in my culture right now, right? That might teach someone or influence someone to act that same way in another culture where that action is bad, right? Tricky stuff. Tricky stuff. This all points to that there are problems in our theory, right? And when we try and justify or condemn actions with this theory of sin, it's not foolproof. And it also points to that we should listen to God, right? That's what sin is. Just read the Bible and do the do's and don'ts, right? Our theory's problems in needing God's data. Do what the Bible says. God knows what creates utility and what doesn't. God knows all of the repercussions of all of our actions throughout all time, right? So just do what He says. Just do what He says. That's what sin is and what's not sin, right? We've just got to do what God says, and then we'll be great. And I totally agree. Good ringtone, by the way. I had to stop and say it. My mom has this ringtone. No, I won't even go there. It's so ludicrous. So we need to abide by God's data. Do what He says. End of series. No, right? Of course, that's what we should do, right? But if it's as simple as that, why are we having this series? Why are we thinking about what's sinful and what's not? Is it just because we haven't read the Bible enough? No. For some, yes. But for Christianity as a whole, no. There's obviously some conversations that need to be had, and the Bible even recognizes this. There's gray area. Gray area? You mean it's not laid out simply in black and white how I should live my life and how I can act appropriately in every situation, in every different culture? Sorry to say, but yes, right? There's gray area in the Bible. If we're going to try and do what the Bible says, black and white, no questions asked, well, I think we've been trying to do that for 2,000 years. And look what happened, right? Because the Bible doesn't want us to do that. The Bible wants us to think for ourselves. Use one of the great gifts that God gave us, our brains, right? We've got to think. We've got to study. We've got to pray. We've got to work. I'll tell you one thing that we assume wasn't there in paradise when the world was working perfectly, but it was, is work. Even in the garden, Adam had a job. We're built to be productive, right? We're made to be productive, so we got to work. That's what we got to do. But let's jump back in. What does the Bible say? And one thing that I like about this setup here is you know exactly how much time we have left in the message today. So you can get excited if you want to go eat your lunch or whatever. It's the Pro Bowl today, so who cares? By the way, if you're rooting for the 49ers, you can get out. Okay. There we go. I actually don't care. That's just a joke. I worked with this one guy, and I shouldn't waste precious message time on stupid stories that don't apply to the message. But I had this one coworker. I'm going to anyway, spoiler alert. I had this one coworker at Five Guys Burgers and Fries who loved the 49ers. He loved them. And any time that I came in when the 49ers were in the playoffs, he'd go, Niners! Niners! And I don't even know if that's like their thing or not, but that's what he would do. He'd just say, Niners! Niners! And it drove me nuts. So don't go saying Niners to me, church. I don't want to hear it. Okay. Back to original programming. What does the Bible say? That's a great idea to just do what the Bible says, no questions asked. Because the more that we know God, the more that we know, yeah, this dude knows what he's talking about. And if he can see all the data for all the time of all people's hearts, he's got a better idea of what's going to be good for people and what's not going to be good for people, what's going to have negative repercussions in the future. He wrote the universal law. He wrote it, so he knows the best how to abide by it. Just do what he says. Okay. What does he say? Let's find out. Grace period, vague commandments. The Old Testament, right? God laid out a law for the nation of Israel and people that were following him. And it was very, 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 very meticulous. It told you exactly when to sit, stand up, and clap your hands, right? Every part of it was down to the T, right? How much you should tithe, what color shirt you should wear to what Sunday service, on which Sunday, right? It was impossibly meticulous. And God says, hey, you want to be righteous? Do all of this. But it couldn't be done, right? And he tested it out for a couple thousand years, right? And no one could keep it. No one could do exactly what he wanted in that culture, right? So there's a second era in the Bible. There was the law and the prophets, and we went through that whole test period, and we saw that trying to gain righteousness through works and actions was impossible. And God did this whole law so that we could see and understand that. And he moved us into the better way. That's when Jesus came, right? That's what this is all about. Jesus said, you can never be perfect through works. You can never achieve righteousness through how you live. Here's the better way. I'm going to send me. Here's my son. He'll do it perfect. He'll understand me completely. He'll get everything right. And then he'll sacrifice himself for you. And then you will live by grace. That's where we are now. That's the second era. It's called the New Covenant, right? And so now we're in this period of living under grace, and it's very, very different. And what happened when we transitioned into this period of grace? What is probably 75% of the New Testament about? It's Paul convincing all these Jews to say, hey, we're not under the law anymore. Things have changed. And all those super, super, super meticulous do's and don'ts that God said, they don't apply anymore. And you think, whoa, Josh, that can't be right. I've got some citations up here, and I couldn't even put verses because there are entire books dedicated to Paul's argument for this. All of Romans, all of Galatians, all of Ephesians. I would even argue all of 1 Corinthians, all of Acts. In Acts, they literally have a meeting, all of the super apostles, as Paul calls them, and they say, hey, what should we do about the law? And they say, okay, let's keep these three things. Sexual immorality, and don't drink blood, and don't worship idols. And then they said, okay, that was it. So we did away with all of these super, super meticulous do's and don'ts. The Bible says all the time, Christ came and fulfilled the law. He did it once and for all. And now we're done, right? And we're living in this brand new world where following God takes a lot more thought, right? We've got to dig in a lot more because now we can apply this new grace period to all kinds of different cultures worldwide forever. So we have to try and understand without these meticulous do's and don'ts what to do. Because if we look at, you might be saying, Josh, what about in the New Testament? Aren't there definite things that it tells us to do in this new era? Yeah, there's some, but you don't have to argue them. They still say things like, don't be corrupt, don't lie, don't kill. Those things are still all very evident, but it's under this guise of our theory of sin. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? And then the rest of the commandments are fairly vague and theoretical, right? It's things like love mercy, be a living sacrifice, right? There's all these different things where we go, okay, but how do we quantify that in our own lives to the T? Let's turn over to Romans 12. That's going to be our main scripture for today. And we're just going to see a couple examples of this. And we're going to start in verse 9 today. This Romans 12 kind of, I think, perfectly articulates a brief overview of how our lives should look when we're following God in this new grace period, right? It's not do's and don'ts. It's not go to this restaurant or that restaurant or do this or do that, right? It's kind of got an overview of how our character should look and general rules that we should abide by as Christians, right? So here's Romans 12. We're going to start in verse 9. It's on page 1064 in the NIV Bibles in your pews. Follow along or just listen. Here we go. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Let's stop right there. How much? When? Where? How much do I give? What do these things mean? Love must be sincere. I could think on that for a month. Okay, I know sincerity is important, and I know that I should be loving, and I know that I should combine those two things. That's great teaching, right? We just learned how to be more godly in our lives. But when we put that into practice, we've got to decide what that means for ourselves around who we're around, right? My love here looks different than my love at the theater or Advia Credit Union or with my friends, right? Not super different, but there are some subtle differences, right? My love with my cat, right? I don't have kids, so the cat's the closest thing, and I have to discipline the cat, and that's a part of my love. At Advia Credit Union, I'm just one of the cattle, so it's not my job to discipline anybody, right? So those loves look different. I have to know how to apply that principle to my life in these different situations. We're already seeing the vagueness, right? So that's why our theory of sin is still useful, right? It's not irrefutable because we don't have the sufficient data, but it does still help us articulate how to be godly in every situation with an educated guess. Disputable matters. This is a term that I love that Paul has coined, right? He says 2 chapters later in Romans 14, he starts talking about disputable matters. Things that are up to argument, right? He says that there are a lot of things where one Christian might think, no, this is godly, and another Christian might think, no, this is godly. Maybe they're both right in their situations, but that's besides the point. All I'm pointing it out to say is that there are things that are in dispute, right? If the whole New Testament was super, super black and white, we wouldn't have disputable matters, but they came from somewhere, and Paul says that that's okay, right? What does he ask us to do with disputable matters? And this is how we're going to end our message for today, and we'll get even more into it next week. We're going to be talking about moderation, because that's something that he brings up as well. Disputable matters, what Paul asks us to do with our actions when we're uncertain about them. Live in conviction. Whatever you're going to believe, whatever you decide, we don't have the data to know for sure. And if God didn't say this is right or wrong, absolutely full stop, black or white, which there's very, very little of in the New Testament, right? Then we have to decide for ourselves. That's deciding for yourself with thought and prayer and reasoning and logic and evidence, right? With a theory of sin that says, hey, here's why I think it's godly or not godly. That's living in conviction. Whatever you decide, right? Whatever you, not decide, that's not a good word. Whatever you come up with, right? That is godly and why it's godly. Take that to the grave, right? If you're going to believe it, have a reason to believe it. Have conviction, right? And then tell God when you get there. Paul says that's the way to do it, right? Whatever you're going to believe, believe with all your heart, right? Let's go over to chapter 14. And start in verse 22. This is the end of the chapter after Paul kind of talks about some of the usual disputable matters. That's on page 1065. It's just the next page over. So whatever you believe about these things, the disputable matters, keep between yourself and God. Whoa. Keep between yourself and God. Who has a hard time keeping their opinions to themselves? Keep it to yourself and to God, right? Blessed. Let's say that word together. Blessed. That means God approved. Blessed. I love that word. Blessed is the one who does not condemn himself by what he approves. But whoever doubts is condemned if they eat, because their eating is not from faith, and everything that does not come from faith is sin. So Paul this whole time is talking about one of the big controversial things at the time is, can we eat pork, right? Because they're coming off of this kosher lifestyle. And he says, hey, if you think it's godly to eat, then eat. But if someone told you that it's godly and you haven't worked that out for yourself, if you're not convinced and you do it and you feel bad about it, then it's sin, right? The action isn't sinful in itself to you. It's what you've come up with and why, right? On the opposite end too, blessed is the one who does not condemn himself by what he approves. But whoever doubts is condemned if they eat. So, point being, you've got to have a reason to believe what you believe about these things that we don't know for certain, the disputable matters. And this theory of sin helps us with that. It's concrete biblical evidence to show us what does God value and what does he not value. He values utility, and he doesn't value pain, hurt, death, right? When we see that and apply it to our lives, we'll see, hopefully, that it'll make us look more like Jesus. If you're interested about that whole, that last section, it's really quite deep, and we needed to dissect that whole chapter 14 to get it totally right. But if you want to do that, that's some good homework. That means we're done. Blue screen means we're done. Okay, we're going to have a word of prayer, take an offering, and then sing 2 more songs, and then we'll be dismissed. I hope you have a great day. I hope you learned something today. And remember, a lot of these messages, they're more difficult, right? Some of them, it's not super, super easy all the time. That's good. Take it home. Doggy bag messages are the best messages because you have to be nourished by them on your own, right? We've got to take this faith home and have it be independently useful.